topic. It reminded me reading about cricket in British newspapers. I understood the words, but none of the concepts. I conceived this program last fall after discovering that most members of the Learning and Retirement Current Events Discussion Group were just as baffled as I was about cryptocurrency. So after Christmas, I sought out someone from one of the 5 colleges who could enlighten us. And my search led me to today's speaker, Professor Neil White. Professor White is an assistant professor of economics at Amherst College. He received his AB degree from Princeton and a master's and PhD degree in economics from the University of Texas at Austin. At Amherst, Dr. White teaches macroeconomics, and his research interests include understanding the effects of monetary and fiscal policy on the labor markets. Before turning it over to Professor White, I have a quote from John Oliver, the host of Last Week Tonight, that I think sums up my feeling about cryptocurrency before today. Cryptocurrency is, quote, said Mr. Oliver, everything you don't understand about money combined with everything you don't understand about computers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor White.
All right, thanks, Jay. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, good. I'm gonna start sharing my screen now. Okay, now can everybody see my screen? Great, great. So when you start to think about cryptocurrency, I was trying to find the right metaphor, and I kind of got stuck between what would happen if you'd never seen an onion and all of a sudden you came across one. What would you start to do with it? And the other is if you accidentally fell into a pond that was covered in ice. they're similar metaphors, and we'll see those kind of along the way. So the plan for the talk is I hope to at least demystify a little bit of the cryptocurrency world and the crypto adjacent world. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes up front about just why cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, why it exists in the first place. Then we're going to watch a video from a professor from Duke University as part of a course on financial crises. It gives an overview and history of Bitcoin and the crypto technology. That'll be about 15 minutes. Then I'll give a sort of more in-depth talk about how Bitcoin works. And then I hope maybe the last 25 to 30 minutes, we can do a question and answer thing. Because there's so much about this space that's really interesting and confusing. I think I'd maybe just leave it open to questions rather than focusing on specific things in a predetermined way. So let's first talk about why cryptocurrency exists. So Bitcoin, since this was the first cryptocurrency, provided an answer to a fundamental question. The question is this. So we all know I can give you physical currency in exchange for goods or services, and no third party needs to know about it. You have my $10 bill now, and I don't. And the question is it possible to do something similar with something that is not a physical object? Can you do the same thing electronically? This is actually a pretty fundamental question in computer science. And here's the problem, right? You might think, well, I can transfer money electronically right now. I pay my electricity bill online. I bought something from Amazon yesterday, and I didn't go to Seattle to deliver a $20 bill. If I do that in technology that existed prior to 2008, if I transfer money to someone, say like buying something on Amazon as an example, it goes through the banking system. I have a bank account that tells me how much money I have or what my credit card balance is. They adjust that number as the arbiter, and they transfer the money to your bank, who then puts it in your account. There's this third party of the banking system and ultimately the Federal Reserve System that regulates banks and manages the payment system that that are the arbiters of this, the ones who say with authority, Amazon has that $20 now and I don't. And it requires that third party to authenticate it, to manage the ledger, if you will, the history of transactions, to say that they have the money now and I don't. If there weren't that third party, you would just have to sort of somehow rely on me to be honest and deduct from my account, whatever that even means, some amount of money to say that instead of $5,000, I now have $4,980 because I've transferred $20 out. The real issue is, how do you know, without that third party definitively saying so, monitoring both sides of the transactions, how do you know that I sent the money to you or I sent the money to Amazon and did not send that money to someone else? That's not a problem with physical currency because it's a physical object. That is a problem with anything that's electronic because it's essentially just some amount of computer code. So I send baby photos. I have a 2-year-old daughter. I send photos of her to my grandparents all the time. But when I do that, we now both have a copy of that photo. This is kind of a related question. Is there a way without some third party saying so that would let me send a photo of her to my grandparents so that I no longer have it and they do? I guess that's possible. Maybe Apple or some company could actually manage that. I'm not sure exactly why you'd want to do that, but it's another sort of theoretical question. Is it possible to do something like that without some third party authority being involved? It turns out the answer to that question is yes. And it was proposed in this paper by a pseudonymous person with the name of Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008, in actually a pretty short paper that was posted to the internet and explained exactly how you can do this, kind of in broad brush terms. And there's a link to this, so when you get these slides, you can actually look at the paper. It's about 10 pages long. It's got a little bit of math involved, but it's not actually that complicated. And so this problem was solved with the creation of Bitcoin. Now, you're probably saying, well, how is this solved? Well, that's what we're going to do now. We're going to watch a video. It's going to talk a little bit more about this history and talk about some of the mechanics of how this works. And it's, like I said, it's a bit like getting used to cold water in the pool. You've got to kind of jump in. So there are going to be 2 terms that are introduced in the video, and this is going to be by Colin Fullkamp of Duke University. There are going to be 2 terms that he introduces in this video that we're going to come back to and explain in more detail afterwards. So be aware that you're going to see these terms and you're going to be like, what the hell is that? Those 2 things are public key cryptography and cryptographic hash functions. So this is terminology that we're not going to be able to avoid if we want to kind of understand what's going on. So I have no advice to you other than get used to it. Let's start using those terms. That's how we're going to sort of jump into the pool and get used to the water. Public key cryptography and cryptographic hash functions. So that's that first outer part of the onion. He's going to bring in the next half, or the next layer of the onion, and I hope to keep going for a little bit after that. So let me pull up the video and we'll start watching, and I'll just verify that everybody can see it once it starts. When I push play, just give me a nod that you can see the video and that you can hear it as well.
Satoshi Nakamoto, the enigmatic person or persons who created Bitcoin, has been quoted as saying that e-currency transactions can be secure and effortless without the need to trust a third-party middleman, such as a government or central bank. What it requires is secure individual transactions and verifiable record-keeping capability in the e-money exchange system. But Augustine Carstens doesn't agree.
I just paused it. I just want to make sure that there's no issue with the sound or anything. Can everybody hear okay? Okay, good.
Carstens is the head of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And he's a former deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. So he knows a thing or two about money. Carstens says that Bitcoin is a combination of a bubble, a Ponzi scheme, and an environmental disaster. So who's right? Are cryptocurrencies a better form of money that will eventually displace government-issued currencies? Or are they a speculative toy, like some of the old .com turned .bomb stocks? And are they an impending financial or environmental disaster? The environmental reference relates to the immense computing power and all the implied activity at coal-fired power plants required to operate Bitcoin. About 32 terawatts of electricity a year, enough to power 5.4 million U.S. households, according to the Digiconomist website. To find some answers to these questions, we should dig into the history of cryptocurrencies and the nuts and bolts of how they work. We also ought to look for insight into the field of financial economics, especially market development, one of my main interests. In April 2013, 7 cryptocurrencies circulated with a market value of $1.6 billion, according to the widely quoted source CoinMarketCap.com. By January 2018, more than 1,300 cryptocurrencies traded with a market value of nearly $824 billion, before an abrupt market correction wiped out more than 2/3 of the market's value. The most important lesson I've learned from studying financial markets over the years is that markets develop and innovate out of necessity. That is, successful new products and services are created when existing products and institutions don't provide us with all the choices we want. So we devise new ones, and this was the case with Bitcoin. And the driving force was as much political as financial. Most of us take for granted the government's role in the creation and regulation of money. We might like the fact that the government stands behind the US dollar. But there's always been a libertarian school of thought, which argues that money should be privately provided and regulated instead. And this debate has profoundly affected the history of the monetary system in the United States. The US didn't have a central bank for most of its first 150 years of existence. Even when the Federal Reserve System was created in 1913, it was decentralized, at least in part to better respond to local needs. Now, the libertarian view is that money should be privately issued and circulated beyond the influence and control of government. Libertarians also want money to feature anonymity, so that people can buy and sell what they want without being spied on and not be prosecuted because of their choices. Still, all money needs to deliver 3 basic services. It must first maintain its value over time, second, be universally accepted as payment for goods and services, and third, function as a way to measure earnings, expenses, debts, and assets. Of these requirements, the 2 most important to libertarian thinkers are that money maintain its value and its anonymity. The belief is that if a currency achieves these 2 characteristics, value and anonymity, it will also be attractive for making purchases, loans, and investments. Given these qualifiers, gold seems like an obvious alternative. But it's too impractical, especially for long-distance transactions. Other problems, like security, also make gold a costly substitute for currency. Still, with the advent of the internet and advances in cryptography to make electronic messages secure, as well as to obscure the sender's identities, gold did get a new chance to become the standard for private money. This was through a venture called e-gold. A former oncologist named Douglas Jackson in Melbourne, Florida, started e-gold in 1996. His company sold gold and other precious metals at a 5% markup over market prices to anyone. But rather than deliver the physical commodity, e-gold issued electronic claim checks to its customers. In turn, the account holder could make electronic payments to anyone else who had an e-gold account. And these electronic claim checks were always completely backed by bullion or coins in e-gold's vaults. The company started to take off in about 2000, and by 2005, it had 3.5 million customer accounts in 165 countries, second only to PayPal in handling online payments, though a distant second. But while e-gold accounts were anonymous, the company couldn't be. And this made it vulnerable to government regulators, who discovered that some e-gold customers used its electronic claim check system to launder money and run investment scams. The FBI and the Secret Service raided eGold in December 2005, and Jackson and the firm pleaded guilty to crimes connected to money laundering and operating an unlicensed money transmission service. eGold's essential design flaw with respect to the libertarian goal of anonymity was to incorporate a central institution into the operation. Without its servers hosting accounts and verifying payments, and without its vault storing the bullion, there was no product. But that also made it vulnerable to that nemesis of libertarians, government interference and regulation, thereby defeating its purpose as a private currency. So, back to the drawing board. A truly anonymous currency must come with some way of tracking ownership and making transfers without a central institution to oversee these accounts and transactions. And the currency has to find a way to maintain its value. These are difficult requirements. Jackson later tried to recreate eGold in full compliance with financial regulations, but it never took off. Still, plenty of libertarian-leaning computer programmers were up for the challenge. In 2008, a white paper released under the name of Satoshi Nakamoto described the system known as Bitcoin, followed by the supporting computer code. And in January 2009, Nakamoto mined the first coins, bringing Bitcoin into existence. Mining is the process of spending computer power to process transactions, secure the network, and keep the system synchronized. Agents who perform these activities are rewarded with new Bitcoins, hence they're miners. Most knowledgeable observers are convinced that Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym, but to this day, nobody knows the true identity of the person or persons who created the code. Within a few years, Nakamoto basically disappeared from the web. By this time, however, Bitcoin was becoming an established electronic money. And while its design is far from perfect, it achieves the two main goals of a private currency. First, supply limitations help Bitcoins retain value. Nakamoto established a hard upper limit of 21 million Bitcoins. And the rate at which new Bitcoins are created is also restricted. On average, about 25 new Bitcoins are created every 10 minutes. In the future, that number will fall by half each time a certain number of transactions is reached. It should take until about 2140 to mine all 21 million Bitcoins. In addition, Bitcoin users remain anonymous without the need for a central institution to keep transactions secure. Nakamoto achieved this by combining two standard cryptographic techniques, a public-private key system and cryptographic hash functions. The public-private key secures payment instructions. Users exchange these instructions via coded digital signatures. The hash function is embedded in the record of all transactions in a way that immediately reveals whether any part of the record has been tampered with. Let me explain this in more detail, since it takes us to the heart of the innovation of Bitcoin, the blockchain. A cryptographic hash function is a computer program that takes a set of data and makes a label for it, called a hash. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies use these hashes to establish tamper-resistant public records. Each hash looks like a string of random characters, though it really isn't random, and each has a fixed length. Different data sets can be assigned to the same hash, but so long as the hash is long enough, finding an alternative data set with that same hash is computationally demanding and time-consuming. Now let's examine how these cryptographic hashes are used to make the record of payment instructions tamper-proof. Each payment message broadcast to the network is verified using the public-private key, and each valid message is bundled into a list called a block. The maker of the block, a Bitcoin miner, will write an introduction to this list called a header. The miner places the hash of the most recently created valid block in the header of the block he or she is writing. So each block in the chain starts off with key information about the previous block, hence the term blockchain. The blockchain is tamper-proof in the following sense. You can select any block in the chain and feed this data set into the hash function to calculate its hash. If the resulting hash doesn't match the hash written into the header of the next block, then at least one block has been tampered with, and we should discard one or both. The miners who built the blocks have an incentive to check the validity of each payment message and each block because they're rewarded with new bitcoins for each new valid block they add. But they must compete against all other miners for the right to add new blocks to the blockchain by solving puzzles based on hash functions. The problems are basically in the form of find a 256-character string of letters and numbers that has a hash value less than this number. The target number, by the way, gets smaller as more blocks are added, making the problem that much more difficult to solve. Bitcoin miners use powerful electricity-guzzling computers to guess solutions to these problems. Each coin requires several $1,000s worth of electricity to operate the computers that mine it. The high rates of energy consumption underscore why Augustine Carstens and others refer to Bitcoin as an environmental disaster. And is it really that secure? If we consider only the blockchain, the honest answer is probably. Enormous amounts of computing power and coordination would be required to forge bogus blocks and have them successfully added to the blockchain. And that's what you'd have to do to steal other people's Bitcoins. So as of now, the system is tamper-resistant. But we should never say never, especially when it comes to technology. And some other components of the Bitcoin system are much less secure than the blockchain. For example, individual Bitcoin accounts remain private only if their holders are careful with their passwords. And Bitcoin exchanges, where Bitcoins are bought and sold, have been notoriously easy to hack into. These issues aside, Bitcoin was a breakthrough in terms of achieving the libertarians' ideal of private money that governments couldn't interfere with. So it became a currency of choice for people who were suspicious of centralized authority or who wanted to avoid outside interference with their business. For example, Bitcoin facilitated the creation of the online black market known as Silk Road, which was a platform for selling illegal drugs and other illicit services. Like any successful product, Bitcoin inspired imitators. And because its inner workings were open to the public, many newcomers simply tweaked Bitcoin's code and gave their currencies different names. There are more than 1,500 cryptocurrencies today. But users and programmers also began to realize that Bitcoin's best feature is its blockchain architecture. Government-provided money, especially electronic money routed through the traditional banking system like credit and debit card payments, remains faster and cheaper to use. By comparison, paying with Bitcoin incurs relatively high transaction fees and takes time to verify. So I would say that the only compelling reason to use Bitcoins is as a speculative investment, or for making transactions you don't want the government to trace. Indeed, its suitability for speculation likely contributed to Bitcoin's inclusion, at least in name, in a multitude of entrepreneurial ventures, some of which were fraudulent, and also in its bubble-like run-up in market value in 2017 and early 2018. Putting the greater fool theory into practice, some people bought Bitcoins expecting that bigger fools would pay even more for them in the future. This is why Augustine Carstens referred to Bitcoin as a combination of bubble and Ponzi scheme. On the other hand, Carstens didn't give enough credit to the blockchain technology underpinning Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Blockchain technology could also be used to verify that the salmon you grill for dinner was actually caught in the wild by a ship that was complying with fishing regulations and prepared following proper worker safety and food handling practices. In addition, blockchains could even contain language outlining a fully developed contract, along with instructions to execute and enforce the contract under a variety of circumstances. As an example, another cryptocurrency, Ethereum, is based on a blockchain architecture permitting so-called smart contracts to be embedded in its blocks. This raises the possibility of creating self-activating and self-enforcing contracts of all kinds, perhaps even ones that could back an electronic currency with claims on real assets, like e-gold. In short, blockchain technology has immense promise to change and improve the way that businesses and governments operate. But in my opinion, cryptocurrencies are among the least useful applications of this technology. I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually fade from popularity like so many other investment fads and bubbles. In my view, many of us would be better off taking our money out of the cryptocurrencies and betting on blockchain technology instead.
Okay, so I'm guessing now you probably have even more questions, and that's okay. This is, peeling back that onion involves some tears sometimes. So we're going to go over a lot of the stuff we talked about again. And what I'd recommend after we go through this again is then, since you'll have access to this recording, presumably you can go back and watch the video again with sort of greater understanding of some of the details of the things he's talking about. Okay, let me make this bigger. Okay, so what I want to do in just a second is go into some of the details of kind of exactly how Bitcoin works. Now, I'm using Bitcoin as the example here because it was the first one. And in a way, it's kind of the simplest one. Everything that came after is sort of improvements or modifications, but we can talk about that after or in the Q&A section, if that interests you. One question you might have is, what is a Bitcoin? It is nothing more than an entry in a database that says you have it. So in this thing called the ledger, which is a history of all transactions, we'll talk about where that comes from in a minute, it says in a computer coded format that Jay Russell owns 40 Bitcoins. I presume you don't actually own 40 Bitcoins, but that's what it would say. It would say it would have an identifier for you. It's not your actual name. It's not associated with your private information, but all it is, it says how many you have based on previous transactions. And that's all it is. It's nothing physical. It's nothing but essentially an entry in a database that confirms how many you are in possession of. That's not actually that weird. That's how pretty much all of your wealth is right now, is entries in a database, other than your physical wealth if you own a house or something. But if I go and look at my bank account, I have, I think, $20 in cash on me and no other cash other than maybe some quarters in my car. I have a lot more money than that. It's just that it's entirely entries in the database at my Bank of America account. Bank of America tells me how many dollars I have here, how many are in my investment accounts and all that. If I look at my checking account and see that I have, say, a few $1,000s in there, that then is money that Bank of America has in its account at the Federal Reserve System, which is just, and the Federal Reserve System is just entries in their database that says this is how much money Bank of America accounts have. So your regular money is also, for the most part, nothing more than entries in a database. So the fact that Bitcoin is just something that says this is how much you have isn't actually that different from the traditional banking system. But the traditional banking system is managed by these authorities, by large banks, and ultimately by government regulation. Bitcoin is not. Bitcoin is entirely decentralized. And we're going to talk about the technology that allows that to happen. But fundamentally, what it isn't actually that different from money in a bank account. So the two key aspects of Bitcoin are this public ledger, which is managed by and involves these cryptographic hash functions that he mentioned in the video, and public key cryptography, what he called the public-private key system. So we're going to talk about those and where they fit into this entire process of a transaction of Bitcoins. All right, so suppose that I want to transfer some amount of Bitcoin to someone else. We're going to talk about how that process works and how we can confirm that I actually had them in the first place and that you have them now. So public key cryptography is something that's been around for a long time. It's actually kind of got, I think it was first investigated by some really famous mathematicians from the 1800s. But it's essentially a method by which anyone can send a secret message to someone or verify that someone took some action. It's an electronic method, but it has a physical analog, and this is the physical analog. Suppose that I have a case, like a treasure chest, and I have stuck to it, like one of those pins at the bank, a key that locks it. But there's a separate key that unlocks it. So it's a 2-key lock. There's one key that locks it, one key that unlocks it. The key that's the outside, anybody can use it to lock the case, but I have the unlocking key. What this allows me to do is I can send you the case, you can put in some gold or some valuables in there, and you can lock it and send it back with that key still attached to it, but only I can unlock it. So that allows you to send me some secret message or something valuable that no one else can steal because only I have the key, the key that opens it, the key that unlocks it. That's known as the private key because only I have it. The key that's, with that little chain like at the bank is the public key because anybody can access it. And so if we think about how this is used in practice, there's computer codes that do this. Suppose Bob wants to send Alice a message that says, "Hello, Alice." He has access to Alice's public key because anybody can access it. Alice basically says, if you want to send me a secret message, use this computer program that locks that message. And you don't have to worry about it being intercepted because only I can unlock it with my private key. It's exactly the same as with the physical chest with the 2 separate keys. All right, so Bob writes a message. He uses the key to encrypt it. It spits out a bunch of nonsense that can't be understood by anyone unless you have the private key to unlock it. And then it comes back to "Hello, Alice," so Alice can see Bob's message. This is a slightly different application of this, though, is used in Bitcoin. And that's to effectively digitally sign something. So we can do a slightly different scenario where Alice has a key, a private key, that effectively signs something. It appends some code to a message that is public. So now it's the message that's public, right? Alice doesn't care if anyone sees that she's saying hello to Bob, but what she cares about is that Bob knows it came from her and not someone else. So now what she does is she uses the private key to add this bit of code to the message with her private key. And what Bob can do with the public key is unlock that bit of code, and it'll spit out an answer, yes or no. It'll say yes if it came from Alice, that is, if this code was generated by this private key. It'll say no if it wasn't. So if he gets a message that says, "Hello, Bob, this is Alice," he can apply that public key and find out if it actually came from her or if it's fraudulent, someone's pretending to be her. This is the key for how transactions are announced in the Bitcoin world. So if someone wants to transfer some Bitcoins to you, what they do is they essentially write a message, sign it with their private key, and anyone who wants to can verify that it did indeed come from them by using their public key to verify that that code only came from them. And these keys are mathematically linked in a way that is hard to figure out what that private key is. And it's in a way that's related to cryptographic hash functions, which we'll talk about in a second. Right, so it's essentially just a method of signing something and allowing others to verify it, but no one else can really forge your electronic signature. Now, I've mentioned this thing called the ledger for a few times, and it's simply a record of all past transactions of Bitcoins. Every single time that anybody in the world has ever transacted a Bitcoin, sent Bitcoin to someone else, or received them, that is in that ledger. And it's just a computer file. And everyone involved in Bitcoin has a copy of it. So if you were to set up a Bitcoin client that communicates with all other people on this network, you would have a copy of that ledger on your computer. We'll talk about how it's generated and changed, how we decide what goes in the ledger and what doesn't, how we can make sure that false transactions don't ever go in there. We'll talk about that in a minute, but for right now, for seeing how this transaction is set up, we'll just assume that everybody has it. And we'll see how it's changed once we start introducing new transactions. So let's think about something concrete. Alice wants to give Bob 30 Bitcoins. So she writes a message that contains the following. I should mention, by the way, who you are in this Bitcoin network is not your real name. I mentioned that, right? Because we want anonymity in this, at least in theory. It is your public key that is used to verify your private signature. Your public key is your identifier in the Bitcoin network. So in fact, your name is what is used to verify that you indeed have sent some message through the system. That's the only thing that identifies you. And that's what's in the ledger too. It'll say your public key and how many Bitcoins you got on what date from whom. So if Alice wants to give Bob 30 Bitcoins, she writes a message that contains the following information: how many Bitcoins she has and who she got them from. So all the transactions in which she ever received Bitcoins from the ledger. And who she got them from, again, just identified by their public key. So she doesn't actually know who the person is, but she knows their unique identifier. She also says how many Bitcoins she is transferring to Bob, naming him using his public key, which is just, I haven't said what these are. These are really just alphanumeric strings of characters, letters and numbers that uniquely identify you. She's going to also include how many of the Bitcoins she has that she is keeping for herself, and how many Bitcoins constitute what's known as the transaction fee, which I'll come back to in a bit. As you probably saw from the video, verifying these transactions costs a lot in terms of computing power. And so the transaction fee goes to the people who verify these, but we'll come back to that in a minute. She signs the message using her private key and broadcasts it to everyone. So it gets announced on the network. Anyone who is on the Bitcoin network can see that Alice, identified by her public key, is transferring 30 Bitcoins to Bob, identified by his public key. And since it's signed by her private key, they can use essentially her name, her public key, to verify that indeed this is coming from her and not someone else trying to, and say, for example, this isn't coming from Bob, who's pretending, who's trying to fraudulently get Alice's 30 Bitcoins, right? So once she posts that, everyone on the network automatically verifies that it did come from her, right? So if they apply her public key to her message and the answer comes back, no, that's not Alice, that transaction is thrown out and it doesn't get processed any further. Just take a deep breath. Right, so far so good. She's just saying what she wants to transact and everybody's verifying that it is indeed her. The question is, how, after seeing this message, do we know that Bob now has them and Alice doesn't? Right? What's the process? What's the analog in the Bitcoin universe that to Bank of America saying, I've deducted $30 from my account and given it to someone else, right? Because there is no authority here. This is just a bunch of people with their computers and sometimes really large supercomputers attached to this network. The record of this transaction and any other new ones that come about over a period of about 10 minutes are added to the ledger, right? Remember the history of all transactions. These new transactions are added to the ledger in a way that is decentralized and agreed upon, where nobody has the authority to unilaterally change it. And that's what we're going to talk about next. And that's where this cryptographic hash functions come into play. This is really the key innovation of Bitcoin. Everything else existed beforehand, right? That's the way you sign digital documents. That's how you can verify your identity online. That's how your bank can verify that they're dealing with Amazon and not someone pretending to be Amazon. The innovation of Bitcoin is how we add these transactions to a public ledger. And this is also probably the hardest part to understand. So I'm going to try to go slowly. But after I'm done, we can go through it again, and you can even go back and watch the video again or look through the slides again just to try to wrap your head around it. And I should say, when I send these out, I'm going to include sort of a glossary of terms and some links to some additional information if you want to go through this again or look into it more deeply. Okay, so let's talk about the Bitcoin miners. They're the key to how this public ledger is generated and validated. So within a certain time window, in practice, it's about 10 minutes, there are lots of transactions of Bitcoins that are going to be broadcast out to the network, and everyone on the network sees them. These are called a block of transactions, or they will be soon called a block of transactions, and I'm putting that there. It's called a block, that's the term, and this is going to be part of the source of the term blockchain, the blockchain technology that underlies this all. I use this term node here. I realize I didn't define it. There's a lot of jargon in this world, so if there's a term you don't recognize, write it down and ask me, and I will let you know what it means. A node is just any one computer or supercomputer or group of computers that are operating in sync that are attached to this network. So anyone on this network gets all these transactions broadcast to them. First thing that everyone does automatically is they validate these transactions against the existing ledger that they all have. So everyone has a copy of the ledger on their computer. When they get these, they verify that the terms in the ledger, the terms in the transaction, remember part of the message is how every transaction where you've ever gotten Bitcoins, they verify that the number that you're transferring is less than or equal to the number that you've ever gotten, and minus the ones that you've given away. So that goes through every transaction that you've ever been involved in and makes sure that you actually indeed, in this example, that Alice has 30 Bitcoins to give to Bob. Now, since everyone's working from the same ledger, everyone's going to agree. It's either right and millions of people agree and it gets validated, or it's not and everybody disagrees. Once they're validated, Bitcoin miners attempt to add this transaction block to the ledger, to add this new entry of a bunch of transactions to the ledger. If you're thinking about, like the analog is like a ledger that's actually a book of transactions ever made, right? The ledger is a book, a transaction is a line, and a block is one page of lines for those transactions. Anyone can be a Bitcoin miner in theory, but in practice, it requires a lot of computing power. So nowadays, Bitcoin miners are almost always these big firms with big warehouses full of supercomputers trying to add transaction blocks to the ledger. And I'll talk about why that's difficult in just a second. And why the reason they're called miners is they're going to be solving a really hard problem in order to have the privilege of adding this block to the ledger. And in reward, they're going to get some Bitcoins as if they were mining gold, for example. So they're going to come out of nowhere. And so they're going to be granted newly minted Bitcoins if they successfully add the block to the ledger. So now we have to talk about cryptographic hash functions. This is the kind of the most technically involved part. All a cryptographic hash function is a piece of computer code that takes some arbitrary input. It can be a sentence, it can be a number, it can be nonsensical strings of characters. It takes them, you put that into the program, and it spits out an output that is of a fixed length. In the case of the cryptographic hash functions that Bitcoin uses, it's 256 characters. So no matter what you put in, if you take a message, which is just a string of characters, let's call that message M, arbitrary length, it converts it into a string of numbers and letters that are 256 characters long. And then a little bit more jargon, the output from the cryptographic hash function is called the digest. It's just the 256 character number, alphanumeric string that gets spit out by this function. Let me just show you a picture before I talk about the properties of these, because the properties are important, but I just want to make sure you kind of understand what's going on here. This is kind of a picture of what happens. If you have this function, this piece of computer code, the cryptographic hash function, and you type in Fox and say go, it spits out something that looks like this. Now, this isn't 256 characters. This is a simpler example that uses, looks like, what is that? 40 characters. If you put in a full sentence, it spits out a different string of characters. Now, these characters are not by themselves. These characters are unique in that this sentence always maps to this set of characters. And it's very, very hard to find another string of characters that maps to this in practice. Let's go back to the key properties of these functions. That's what I mean when I say that it's hard to invert, meaning it's hard to go from the digest, the output, and figure out what went in initially. That's the way that these functions are constructed, is that it's hard to go backwards. It's not like multiplication, right? So if my cryptographic hash function were take a number and multiply it by 6, if I type in 5, it's going to spit out 5 times 6, which is 30. But it's easy to go back, right? I can figure out that I typed in 5 because my function is just multiplying by 6. I can very easily divide by 6. These functions are much more complicated and are constructed in such a way that it's almost impossible to go backwards, to figure out what you started with just from the output. So it's hard to invert. It's also hard to guess what the output or the digest will look like just from knowing the message. And there's an example in the next slide that I'm going to come to here. This is an example where it puts in the sentence, the red fox jumps over the blue dog, and we get this string of characters, the second row here. If I accidentally misspell over and put in a U for a V, right, almost the same message, one letter is different. The output, the digest, is completely different from the output from the sentence that only differed by one letter. So the function, the cryptographic hash function, is constructed in such a way that one small difference compounds in the process to give you a completely different output. It's not related at all to this one, even though the inputs were very similar. And then these are just two other examples that also differ by just 2 letters, and they're completely different from each other as well. So that's what I mean when I say it's hard to guess what the output will look like just from knowing the message. You might say, oh, I know what the output to the red fox jumps over the blue fox is. Therefore, I might know, have an idea of what the output's going to look like for, if I change one letter. That's not the case for these functions. And finally, it's hard to find another message, which I call M prime, just a different notation. It's hard to find another message that will produce the same output. So what I mean is, because these functions take an arbitrary number of characters and plop them into, in this case, 40 characters, there are going to be some messages that map to the same output, the same digest. But those are really hard to find in practice. So those are the properties of cryptographic hash functions, and they're going to imply some important things for what they're going to be used for. This means that if you want the output, so if for some reason, we'll see what that reason is. If you want the output of a cryptographic hash function to look a specific way, so for example, if you want the output of that 256 character string to have the first 40 characters be all zeros, there's no way to figure out what kind of message is going to generate that other than by trying and trying and trying until you find it. You're going to have to try trillions of different messages to get one that finally gives you one where the first 40 characters are all zeros. And this is the basis for something that's called proof of work, which is key for what Bitcoin miners do. All right, so it's just cryptographic hash function is just a little piece of code that takes a message and spits something else out, and it's really hard to figure out what it's going to spit out. And it's hard to go backwards. That's really all it is. What this means is you can write a problem based on these that's really hard for people to solve. Even if we got a supercomputer, they're going to have to do trillions and trillions and trillions of operations to solve it. So let's come back to the miners now that we have some idea, at least, of what these hash functions are. After the transactions are checked to make sure that they're valid, which everybody does and agrees upon because everybody's got the same ledger, Bitcoin miners hash these transactions. That means they just plug them into a cryptographic hash function, puts them all together into that function in a specific way, but that's not really important for understanding how it works. They put these messages together in the hash function, and then apply the hash function again to that hash of all those transactions and the hash that is plugged into the previous hash function of the previous block of transactions. Okay, so we've got all the new transactions, which we plug into our hash function. It spits out 256 characters. We've also got the previous block in the ledger, the last group of transactions in the ledger. We plug those in the hash function and get another hash. So we've got two outputs of the hash function. We put those together into like a 520 whatever 512 character message, plug those into the hash function and get another output, another digest, right? So in a way, we've sort of combined the current transactions and the last group of transactions into one that's encoded in one 256 character digest or output of the hash function. Now, because we've kind of done them together, that's the sense in which concurrent or subsequent blocks of the blockchain of the ledger are chained together. That's the source of the term blockchain, that we're linking the current transactions with the previous set that were added to the ledger. And also, I'm looking over here because I see everyone's face on this screen, so I'm not looking off into nowhere. But it's hard to get all my screens set up right. Okay, we're almost there. Now, we've got this hash that encodes all the new transactions connected to the previous transactions. For this block to be added to the ledger, a Bitcoin miner has to find another number, which is called the nonce, which is a word used to, I think it's an actual word used to describe a word that only has one meaning or is only used in one instance. This is sometimes seen as like an abbreviation for number only used once. It's a meaningless number, but they need to find this number that when hashed with their other hash, so when you plug the hash that represents the current transaction and the previous transaction, you apply the hash function to that plus this other number, or sorry, concatenated with this other number, it produces an output that begins with a certain number of zeros, or effectively it's small enough. It has to be below some number. So it's got to start with a bunch of zeros to be below whatever that threshold is. And this is what's called the proof of work. So all these supercomputers are trying to find this number that yields an output that starts with 40 zeros, for example. That was my example before, because that's kind of about where it was a few years ago for Bitcoin. Remember the property of hash functions. If you want the output to look a certain way, it's really hard to guess what the message is going to be that produces that digest, produces that output. That's a property of hash functions. So there's no other way to find this nonce, the number that is going to, when added to the hash, produces the output that starts with 40 zeros. There's no other way to find it other than to just start with 0 and start counting up. Start with 0, next is 1, next is 2, next is 3, and you keep going until you find it. So it's going to take trillions of checks to actually find one. And so everyone who's a Bitcoin miner across the world, once they get this transaction data, is starting to do this. They combine it with the previous block through this hash function, and then they're going to try to solve this really hard problem that is entirely pointless. This number, this nonce, means nothing other than to verify that they solved this really hard problem. Once it's found, the nonce is broadcast to everyone on the network. So once someone finds it, they broadcast this number that solves the problem to everyone. Now, because everyone has the exact same set of transactions broadcast to them, and from the ledger, they have the exact same previous block that they combined it with, they can very easily check to see if this is the solution. They just plug it into the hash function and check to see if it gives you something with 40 zeros in front. So this is the property of hash function that's really nice. It's really hard to solve something, to find the nonce. It's super easy. It takes one line of code to check that a proposed solution actually is the solution. So once it's found, it's broadcast to the network. Everyone who's on the Bitcoin network sees it, and all the miners, and actually everyone can do this, but the You don't need a supercomputer to check it. You can verify that indeed it does work, that it solved the problem. If everyone verifies it, and again, they'll all agree because they all are working from the same data, the same ledger and the same input to the hash function. If it's verified, the winner, the person who found the knots, receives all those transaction fees. Remember, I specified that the message that Alice sends has this thing called a transaction fee. The miner who won, who found this knots, found the one that gave us the thing we were looking for, gets the transaction fees and gets newly minted Bitcoins. The number of Bitcoins that they get is actually diminishing over time, so that ultimately it's capped at 21 million Bitcoins will ever be created. And then, this is the important part, the winner's copy, person who won, their copy on their computer of the ledger is copied to everyone else. So the new block of transactions, once they've found this knots, is added to it, and they send the ledger to everybody. And because they're all getting the same copy of the same ledger, once again, everyone has the same copy of the same ledger, history of transactions, and we start over. So let's think about what we've done. We've solved, if we were this Bitcoin miner, we've solved this meaningless problem that has no use other than to be difficult. And ultimately, all we did is we just picked, that was the mechanism by which we picked my ledger to copy over with the new block of transactions. This seems kind of silly. Like, what's the point of doing this? Why don't we just like randomly pick someone to take their ledger? This is because it's so hard to do this is what makes it so hard to put in to basically alter things to make it seem like you have Bitcoins that you don't. This is because it's so difficult to solve this problem, it makes it almost impossible for anyone to go back and alter the ledger in a way that everybody else's ledger is changed too. So thinking about how could we alter the ledger, right? You just have a copy, if you're on the network, the Bitcoin network, you have a copy of the ledger on your computer. It's just a computer file. You know, if you knew, I mean, I don't know how to do this, but you know, if you are a sophisticated computer programmer, you can go in and change that ledger. Anyone could go in and change the file, but you could change it in a way that makes it look like you got some Bitcoins from some person maybe a few weeks ago that you didn't actually get. You can go in and change that ledger on your computer if you want to. But you've only changed your copy, not everybody else's. How can you make sure that everybody else has your copy? The only way to do that is to solve this really hard math problem, even though it's meaningless. So if you wanted to produce a fraudulent entry into the ledger, you have to go back, you have to change it on your computer, and then, this is important, you not only have to win the competition to add the current block to the existing ledger so that your ledger gets copied over, because each block contains the information of the previous block, you have to go back and resolve the math problem, that hard math problem for every block that happened between your transaction that you're adjusting fraudulently and everything that's happened since then to now. What that means is that in order to do that, you'd have to be able to have at least twice the computing power. This is if you were just changing, say, the previous block, you would need to have at least twice the computing power of everyone else on the network combined. And that's, at least at this point, infeasible. And so the further back you go to alter a transaction, the even worse that problem gets. So if you go back 2 blocks, you've got to you've got to do it, you need at least 4 times the computing power of everyone else on the world combined. So it's really hard to alter it. And so that's the sense in which in the video he said, the blockchain itself is, at least with current technology, secure, very secure. I mean, it's going to require either someone with a tremendous amount of computing power and energy resources, or tons of coordination among parties that could somehow combine to do that. And that's the sort of thing of like conspiracy theories where someone would give it up, most likely. So stealing Bitcoin in that way is pretty much infeasible unless you have that kind of resources, and nobody does. Nobody on the network does. So just to add one last difficulty of that, that all has to take place in 10 minutes. You got 10 minutes when the news transactions are posted. You got to make the change in the ledger, go back and resolve those problems for everything that's been done up until that point, and then only then have your ledger posted back. You've got to do all of that in the time it takes anyone else in the world to sometimes by luck find the solution and post it. If you don't get it in 10 minutes, you got to start all over, and your problem's going to be even harder because now there's a new block added to it. So this is kind of the way that the blockchain is secure. And we've now verified, we all agree on the ledger, we've verified that these Alice's Bitcoins have been transferred to Bob, and it wasn't through any one authority saying so, it was through this proof of work process. And it's kind of weird and unintuitive. I mean, that's why it took so long to solve as a computer science problem. That involves solving kind of a pointless math problem that has nothing to do with the process, just to make it hard for anyone else to fake it. So problem solved. We've transferred an electronic token, in this case a Bitcoin, it's just a piece of code in a database, from Alice to Bob. We've verified it through this network of a shared ledger, and we've modified the ledger to include that transaction. So we now know that that happened and it was validated. And now Bob has those 30 Bitcoins and not Alice, no third party intermediary, unlike transferring funds from one bank account to another. So just a couple of additional details, and I think we should just go on to maybe the question and answer part, where we can talk about things like NFTs and central bank digital currencies and stable coins and things like that. Some things that I think I may have mentioned, but I put them here in case I forgot to. The reward for adding new blocks to the ledger diminishes over time. So right now, I think if you add a block to the ledger, I think you get 6.25 Bitcoins, which is a lot. I mean, that's about $250,000. So this is why these companies set up with these huge computer farms to try to solve these pointless math problems, because if they get one, every 10 minutes they have an opportunity to make $250,000. Oh, and then yeah, this part's important. The system is designed so that it takes 10 minutes approximately for the world to solve this hard, complicated, pointless math problem and process these transactions as a new block in the ledger. That means that as more Bitcoin miners enter the network and are trying to solve this problem, for a given level of difficulty, someone in the world is going to be able to solve it more quickly. So what the system is designed to do is, as every 2 weeks it updates the difficulty of the problem that everyone has to solve, and if there are more people solving it and it's solving it more quickly than 10 minutes, they make it a harder problem, which means that these companies are going to be even furthermore using more and more electricity to solve these problems. And it kind of worsens, not just because you're getting more people involved in this, but everybody's got to be doing even more, expending even more power to solve some inherently pointless math problem. So this is sort of the environmental disaster aspect of Bitcoin, if you think it's a disaster, that we're just wasting all this energy for no other purpose than verifying transactions that, if they're legal, maybe should be done through the banking system. And of course, people who are in favor of Bitcoin can say, well, these are powered by hydroelectric power in upstate New York, and there's nothing preventing them from being powered by renewable resources. So I don't really take a strong stance on that, but it does seem like a problem that there's a ton of energy being consumed here. And then just lastly, what do I think the future of crypto is? I largely agree with the conclusion from the video. Prediction is difficult, especially about the future. I would also bet on blockchain technology and not any single application of it. The history of technological adoption, whether it's electricity or the internet or cell phones, is a slow process. Once something is introduced, it typically actually is used in a different way than it ultimately is. Some examples of that just include when factories were powered by steam, they all had to be attached to a single sort of rod that was rotating based on steam power. And that made really dangerous work environments where all these machines are attached physically to this thing and people got their arms cut off and things like that. When electricity power was invented and used to power these machines, people didn't realize, the managers of these factories didn't realize that they could convert the layout of their factory in a safer way and design machines that worked better because they didn't have to be attached to a single power unit. And the similar things happen with the internet, social media. They look very different when they were first introduced to when the form they would ultimately take. So I think blockchain technology is going to be similar. So I will stop there and take questions and have a discussion. I think Mindy was going to moderate that.
Yep, if you guys want to use the raise hand feature and under reactions, because given how many people are in, we can't all see everybody on the monitor. So if you use the raise hand, you'll pop to the top of the screen. And there are a couple of questions in the chat. Neil, if I don't know if you
I can see the chat.
See the chat. If you can't, I can read them to you.
Oh yeah, okay, I see. Let's see.
And then R. Leopold, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't see the questions in the chat as I was presenting, so I'm just going to look through them real quick and just answer these real quick, and then we'll get to everyone who has their hand raised.
Okay.
So Jane asks, why does Bitcoin fluctuate in value? It's whatever people think it's worth. That's what determines its value in terms of money, or like in terms of dollars. Now, a currency is going to have to satisfy three things. It needs to be a store of value, and it has to sort of maintain its value over time. It's a medium of exchange. It's actually used in transactions, and it's what sometimes called the unit of account. It's the thing we measure the value of other things in. The fact that we measure the value of Bitcoin in dollars tells me it's not the unit of account, right? When I went to Starbucks this morning, I got a coffee for $3, not 1/400,000th of a Bitcoin or whatever it would be. So it changes in value based on what people think it will be useful for, or how much they think they'll be able to get it in return in the future. That's kind of the speculative aspect of it. So a few geeks who understand this crazy system get rich? No. Plenty of people who do not understand the system at all get rich. It is entirely luck for many, many people. And yes, if the miners who understand it can get very rich, yes. But the people who invest in it are, for the most part, lucky. I wouldn't say that they're smart necessarily. I'm not saying they're dumb either. This seems like a very complex video game in which progressing to the next level requires computer power to solve a math problem, and winning is getting more Bitcoin. Yeah, I think that's pretty similar. It's like that, although it's a very boring video game. Your computers are just running, getting really hot, and you're just sitting in your office waiting to see if you've won. So how do you get Bitcoin? This is a good question. So I'm not going to answer these together. The way that you get Bitcoin is that there's a couple of ways. Most would get Bitcoin on an exchange like Coinbase, I think is the most popular one. You create an account on there, and it allows you, it does all this technology in the background for you. So you can give them money and they will buy some Bitcoin from someone else in exchange for it. The other way is to actually do it directly. That's going to require some technological sophistication to set up the Bitcoin software on your computer and be connected to that network. There's nothing inherently that prevents you from doing that. It just requires that you know what you're doing. And then would a government created coin have to be mined? I might mention central bank digital currencies in just a minute that maybe would get at that. And then last question, if Putin now wants to accept payments for oil and gas in the form of Bitcoin, why would I trust the goodness of this option? Bitcoin today is 44,000. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. But Bitcoin, so I think something that's frequently mentioned about cryptocurrencies, because it's anonymous, it can lead to facilitating illicit transactions. And, you know, if something you want not to be known by the banking system or government authorities, maybe that's inherently criminal, but not necessarily, right? It's also a possibility of funding dissident groups in authoritarian countries without going through their system. So, you know, if you wanted to get money to dissident groups in Russia or North Korea, you probably aren't going to go through those banking systems, but Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies allow you to get money to those types of things. Okay, so I forgot who was first now with the questions.
Our Leopold, go ahead.
Great, thank you. I'll see if I get my question out before my head actually implodes. So and apologies if part of the question is I get some errors because I didn't understand. But so I get that there's, you know, the somebody has created this arbitrary financial instrument, and it has value because the people playing the game decide it has value. And a lot of the talk had to do with sort of, I think, explaining the process and the security issues. I think my question is more the sort of greater impact of this system. So like an analogy to Wall Street speculation or central bank activities. So in other words, like, I don't really give a crap if Elon Musk loses billions of dollars playing Bitcoin if it doesn't hurt others or society. But either in the future or now is the speculation of Bitcoin. And obviously individuals who are playing can also lose money the same way people who play the stock market are taking a risk. As an aside, there was an interesting article in the New Yorker in December about a guy who lost his password and now can't get a hold of $500 million of Bitcoin because his town won't let him search the landfill. Anyway, but my question is, like, this whole Bitcoin system, what impact does it or might it have on economies, either local or national or world or developing countries, or just, you know, what's the, you know, I'm just naturally suspicious of basically a gambling speculation for people, you know, the extraordinarily wealthy with resources, and then the other people they convince to play the game. So can you talk about the impact of, is it just an internal system, and if you're not in it, you're okay? Or can this have a wider, I mean, there may be positive, but like the development of the security, but does this have a wider negative system on individuals, societies,
Yeah.
etc.?
So I'd first say that the existence of the technology itself the technology hasn't yet been, I think, applied to something that's inherently creating economic value, where we're able to do stuff in a meaningful way that we couldn't before. Not yet. I don't think, but I wouldn't rule that possibility out. I think some of the discussion about smart contracts and things like that is really interesting on the benefit side. And we can talk about that a little more if we want. As far as the costs go, I would break it down into 3 levels: global, national, and local. There are certainly global costs in the contribution of this to climate change and just making energy more expensive. There are certainly local costs to places that are either like in the Silicon Valley area, San Francisco, Palo Alto, where a lot of companies and employment is a lot of companies that employ a lot of people are heavily involved in this thing that might just be pure speculation. So there's that part, and then the place where they're placing a lot of these Bitcoin mining farms. I think there was I was trying to remember where I heard it or read it. It was a story about towns in upstate New York where these mining farms, these just giant warehouses and containers full of computers are going and filling in empty warehouses, but not really employing any people. So there's some other local impacts on that side. I am not, at least right now, worried about greater, I guess, national fallout if crypto or Bitcoin were to completely collapse, because there'd have to be some mechanism whereby it trickled down to the wider economy. In the 2008 financial crisis, that was through big banks. the 2008 financial crisis was essentially a run on banks, just like the Great Depression was. It was just a banking system that wasn't really understood or public or regulated. It was the banking system used by big financial institutions. Big financial institutions are not yet involved to the level where I think this is a concern. However, those large financial institutions are subject to regulation by the US government and the Federal Reserve System that is pretty aware of this. And so there are applications, not crypto specific, to regulations that I think would keep large financial institutions fairly insulated from this. Things like called like capital requirements, and there's aspects of the assets that banks have to own where they have to meet some degree of safety. And these would certainly fall not into the safe asset classes. So I'm not too worried about that right now. So who's next?
Jay?
Yeah, given that we're right in the midst of income tax filing season, some of you who filed your return, or certainly those of you who are yet to do so, are going to notice a question on the 1040 right underneath your name and address. And it says, at any time during 2021, did you receive, sell, exchange, or otherwise dispose of any financial interest in a virtual currency? And I guess my question is, if you have a brokerage account or a mutual fund account, you get a 1099 at the end of the year reporting your capital gains and your losses and your dividends and interest. So I'm wondering, is there any similar system for the Bitcoin industry? And if not, it seems like a means of tax evasion, very easy to do if you're so inclined.
Yes, so for some of these easy to access platforms like Coinbase, or I forget some of the names of the other ones, Coinbase is the biggest one, those are subject to some regulations. I don't actually know for sure if they're required to send you the appropriate tax forms. I honestly don't know. But I also know that if you were to set it up on your computer and do it yourself, if you have the sophistication to do that, there's nobody to know. I mean, it's just entirely self-reported. Kind of like any sort of cash business, honestly, if you're dealing in cash, it's very easy to hide it for tax evasion purposes. That's why criminal organizations work in cash. And that's why, I think you mentioned the Silk Road, which is an online, basically drug market, was heavily involved in Bitcoin as well. So long-winded answer to say, I don't know for those companies that are kind of widely publicized and well-known, and certainly not the case that someone's gonna force you to file a form or declare any sort of transactions of Bitcoin if you're just doing it yourself.
Donald?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, all this talk about money is always mystifying to me. I think back to a time when I went to see a historic place down in Pennsylvania, Hopewell Village, which was an iron forging, an early casting place that made cast iron stoves in the late 1700s. And that was the beginning of the farmers leaving the farm and starting some industrial production and working for money. And of course, there wasn't much currency back then. There was no national currency. And so Hopewell Village kept a ledger, and they kept another ledger in Philadelphia, and whoever worked there could go down to Philadelphia and they could cash in at certain stores and buy what they needed to buy based on the labor credits they had earned. And that was the beginning of the cash economy before there was cash. And eventually the government jumped in several different ways and got into it. And we all agreed that these things were worth something. And this just seems like another version.
Is it a $1,000 bill? What is that?
Oh, no, that's actually $1 million bill.
It's $1 million? Oh.
It's $1 million. I used this one Halloween stack of these. I was going to a Halloween party that had a lot of accountants and lawyers, and I went as a fixer with a bag of these and a wrench and a business card that said guilty as L. But this seems to be just another version of the same thing that we've known with a tech spin on it and a pretty savvy tech spin in a lot of ways, because today you 2 answers ago, you hit on the thing that we have to rely on the government to require the banks to hold a certain amount of equity and not, to support their activities. And we have to have faith in the government to back this up. And of course, I have continual debates with my kids who would love to go back on the gold standard. I don't know why the hell that's important. I don't know what's so great about gold. But it all goes back to, like you said, what's a Bitcoin worth? It's worth what we think it's worth. And this brings me to the ruble, because in your film, the gentleman starts off talking about what is the value of these things. And it seems that the ruble is missing 2 of the 3 values that that he said. And if all the rest of the guys on the block decide to not play the game together, as is happening now, then you're kind of out of play. And now Russia's in a tough spot, because they can't necessarily support the ruble on their own. They're going to try, just like they tried to reopen their stock market with a set of controls. But China might be able to support a currency on their own. They're big enough to have their own market and tell the rest of us to go to hell if they wanted to. It'd be painful, but what do you think of all that? I mean, is there any money? Would you like me to send you a few of these?
Yeah.
I'm willing to share with the group.
I actually did have a real $1,000 bill once. It was, I don't know why they gave it. I had to get a bunch of cash for a trip. This was a long time ago, and it was like $1,200 in cash that I needed. And a $1,000 bill was given to me. I've never seen this before. What do I get? I think maybe it's like Woodrow Wilson. I can't remember who's on it, but then yeah. So okay, societies have it's sort of the history of money is interesting. It's kind of debated not so much amongst economists, but anthropologists and archaeologists actually, whether the first money was actually a pure credit system, whether it was a socially enforced thing, whether it was authoritatively enforced, or whether physical currency in the form of tokens or precious metals were first. It's kind of, every now and then there's like a new discovery that sort of changes the history of that. And you can read about things where these giant rocks were used in Polynesia as forms of currency, but then when they're trying to ship it across to another island, it falls to the bottom of the ocean. And then they just started trading pieces of paper that said, okay, now you own it, now I own it. We all know it's down there, where to get it. Let's see, what else did you mention? Gold standard, terrible idea. No, we should never go back on it. I know it seems to maybe make sense, but it basically caused the Great Depression to be a global phenomenon. Giant mistake to go back on it without some sort of widely reorganized international system. Yeah, the ruble's falling, and we've limited Russia's access to their foreign exchange reserves, right? The foreign currency they would use to buy their own currency to prop up its value, they can't really do that. China certainly has the capabilities of doing that. The question is whether the rest of the world can convince them not to, or to do so in a limited extent. Is there anything else?
Thank you.
Ken? You're muted, Ken.
Yeah, there we go.
There
Okay,
you go.
so I still guess I'm trying to be really practical here. And let's say that I wanted to buy $1,000 worth of Bitcoins. Where do I go to get them, and how do I pay for them? And what would it cost? Understanding there's a high transaction fee. And then conversely, if I wanted to sell that because it's now worth $10,000, how would I go about doing it?
Great question. So that's actually not something that I addressed. I basically only addressed how Bitcoin itself is transacted between individuals.
Right, and that to me is the practical side of it.
The easiest way is to download this app and register with Coinbase. And they're a company that receives Bitcoin, right? So they're connected to the Bitcoin network, and then they sell it to people, their customers, who want to then own it. And then they'll transact it on your behalf through sub-accounts through their node on the system. So if you wanted to buy Bitcoin, you would buy it from a company that is essentially on the node and specializes in trading dollars for Bitcoins. Now, how much it would cost depends on how many you buy. You do not have to buy a single Bitcoin, or you can buy, I think the smallest denomination is like 250. I actually don't remember what the smallest denomination is, but you can buy a very, very, very small portion of Bitcoin. So, if you bought one full Bitcoin, it would cost you right now $40-something thousand. But if you bought 1/1000th of a Bitcoin, which is feasible, it would only cost you $40 plus a fee to the company that is skimming off the top. It's getting it for you. And then if you wanted to sell it back, you would just sell it back to them. You'd have an account with them. It'd be like, if you set up an investment account online on like a Merrill Lynch or E-Trade or something like that, you'd give them money, tell them to buy a share of Apple for you. They do it, and they take a little bit off the top. And when you're ready to trade it for money, you give it back to them. They give you your money back, and they sell it to somebody else.
And along with that, are all these Bitcoins discussed in dollars around the world, or are other currencies like the Chinese yuan or anything else?
Yeah. So very few things are actually denominated only in Bitcoin. So you can buy, if you possess Bitcoins, you can buy certain things online, even from like mainstream sellers, in the form of Bitcoin. But if you go to try to do that, it will tell you the price in dollars and then how many Bitcoins that is based on that exchange rate. So, and similar for any other kind of currency too. If you go onto a European company that accepts Bitcoin, it'll tell you the price in euro and then the euro price of a Bitcoin. There's El Salvador, I think it's El Salvador, right? Yeah, that has accepted Bitcoin as a universally allowed form of payment. I don't know a ton about the details of that situation, since it seems to be very specific to their leader right now, who is very much in this cryptocurrency culture, which is something I didn't touch on because culture is not my area of expertise. But there's, in addition to the technologically weird aspects or confusing aspects of this, of crypto, there's this weird internet culture surrounding it too that's equally hard to understand if you're not plugged into it. So, that involves Twitter and memes and Elon Musk tweeting things out about something that nobody understands, but then a small group of people understands. It's weird and hard to understand.
Yeah. Catherine?
Thanks. I think the stuff about the blockchain is really interesting too. And I just wanted to ask you what you thought about proof of stake as opposed to proof of work. I mean, people have touted that. I mean, basically validators vote on the consensus is weighted by how much they have of Ether or GAT, whatever, on Ethereum. And supposedly it would use much less energy, of course. Miners wouldn't be out there running their computers, gobbling up electricity. And I just wondered what you thought about that, and if you think that actually there's enough of incentive to make the validators actually perform as they should, maintaining the blockchain.
Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
And then after that, I just hope you will go back to GovCoins and talk about the ledger there.
Yeah. So so first on the proof of stake is basically, rather than this proof of work, so just for everybody on the same page, rather than having to solve this complicated math problem, it's essentially tied through, I mean, the scheme can differ in detail, but essentially tied to the idea that if you possess a lot of this currency, it's not in your interest to undermine its value by falsifying ledger entries and things like that. That is kind of more similar, not quite the same, to why like a government provided currency has value. It's sort of relying on people behaving in their interests kind of in the long run. I think it's possible that it's more susceptible to fraud. It's definitely more susceptible than proof of work, but there's a trade-off between the costs of that and not. So I don't know a ton about how it's like going to be applied in the future, but there are other concepts too. Like I say, I've seen there's proof of stake. There's also concept proof of time. There's another one that's proof of but they rely on similar mechanisms to proof of stake, where you're proving that it's somehow not in your interest to forge these ledger items. So yes, I would say that's certainly a possibility, and I wonder if there's a way somehow to incorporate smart contract technology where the blockchain automatically enforces transactions that were validated previously. I wonder if something like that can be involved to enforce those kinds of punishments if someone were to do that.
Well, supposedly Ethereum is going to start using proof of stake sometime this year. So,
and I imagine that there's going to be some, since that's the platform that uses these smart contracts, that would be part of it, but I don't know the details of how they're going to implement that.
Thank you.
And then as for, I was going to talk briefly about central bank digital currencies. Is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Kathy Campbell asked a question earlier about mining, and
so this would be, central bank digital currencies are usually talked about in the context of crypto, even though there's nothing inherently about crypto technology or the blockchain that needs to be involved with central bank digital currencies. The sort of the simplest example of a central bank digital currency would be this, that rather than having a bank account with a private bank that is a member of the Federal Reserve System or of a co-op or any other financial institution, you would instead essentially just have an account at the Federal Reserve and be able to transact with other people with those accounts directly. So if I were going to transfer, Catherine, some money to you, let's just say that you have a bank account with Chase and I have Bank of America. If I'm going to transfer money to you, that money, essentially, ultimately what's happening is Bank of America is deducting my account. The Federal Reserve deducts Bank of America's account at the Federal Reserve. It debits Chase's account at this Federal Reserve, and Chase adds it to your account. So it's all it is when we transact anyway. It's just an indirect method of transferring ledgers, database numbers from one line to another in the Federal Reserve System. So central bank digital currency would essentially just get rid of those middlemen in theory. In practice, is the Federal Reserve going to get into managing retail banking? I doubt it. So you would probably still be through some intermediary. But it's not inherently based on blockchain technology or crypto technology. It's just something kind of similar, but it's still not anonymous, and nor is it not. It's also still going through a centralized system. But I think it is kind of a different thing altogether.
Till?
Just first, thank you for this. It's very, very interesting and informative. Two questions. One is these, I guess you call them Bitcoin exchanges. Is there a possibility for those exchanges to, in fact, cheat their customers? And then secondly, are they themselves regulated. They are not going to be hidden away the way the whole Bitcoin, other part of the Bitcoin system is. My other question is, besides watching this video again, would you recommend an accessible book on this topic?
Yes. So on the first question, yes, they could absolutely rip you off. They are regulated to some degree, but not the same degree as other financial institutions. Regulation is almost always behind the curve, as we saw in 2008, and almost certainly is now. They are more regulated than, if you were to say, connect your computer directly into the Bitcoin ecosystem, you could get hacked. Someone could steal your private key. It's kind of a different, it's more theft you'd be worried about directly rather than fraud, which is possibly a concern with these companies. It's hard to know. I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think a company like Coinbase is going to be ripping you off directly, but what they are susceptible to is hacking, because even though the direct Bitcoin ledger through these technologies can't really be altered or changed, the blockchain itself is safe. These companies have your information on their computer, right? And then they can be hacked, and someone can use their information to make these trades. So it's not just fraud, it's also just security, that they could be hacked, they could be broken into, and your stuff could be stolen from them, the caretakers of your Bitcoins, if you will. And then what was the second question?
Book.
Part of the question was
right. So
a book on this question.
Yeah, so there's a couple of them that I mentioned this. I'm gonna, when I send these slides to everybody, I've got a list. I actually left the version of the slides that had those at home, so I've got to go back and get those. There's a list of various articles, long form articles, and books that, and even more videos that you can watch on the internet for more information on this. So I'll send that out when I send these out.
Thank you.
And the last question, Jim.
Yes, I was reading an article in today's paper, and it referred to, I guess, a vehicle called an FTE. So, would you explain what that is?
I think, do you mean NFT, Jim?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you mean NFT?
I thought it was FTE.
So I think you probably mean NFT, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, a non-fungible token.
I guess so. I
Yeah, I think so.
I think that's what you mean. So if going on that, so yeah, I should have mentioned this more. An NFT is essentially the same thing as like a Bitcoin, in that it's an entry in a ledger that says you possess something. The only difference is there is a quasi physical object related to that, and it's usually an image or a piece of a recording of music or something like that is tangible in some way, but still electronic, something you can hear or see, but still electronic. And this would be like the example I gave kind of at the beginning of photos of my daughter that I send to my grandparents. When I send them a picture, we now both have it. An NFT is essentially the same blockchain technology saying that when I give this image to my grandparents, I no longer have it. They have it. And that's recorded in the ledger through the blockchain, just like the transaction of a Bitcoin is. The only difference is there's this object. Again, it's not a physical object, really. It's still just a piece of computer code, but you now possess it. And the actual process involves a few additional steps, kind of like how when Alice sends Bob some Bitcoins, she has to sign it with her private key. There's some of that involved too with the NFT that are some extra steps. Again, I'm not sure why you would ever want to do that. I'm kind of skeptical a little bit about those other than as a speculative investment, because let's say that I took a screenshot of us here right now. I could create that make that an NFT. There's an original screenshot. It's this file on my computer of all of us in this Zoom room. And then I could sell it to someone. And when I did, it would be through this blockchain technology where they now possess it and not me. The question is, why would that be worth more than just the copy of the image, which you can just do on your computer basically costlessly? I kind of say I'm not sure why that would have value. I think for a lot of these things, they are probably purely speculative in that the value comes from you think someone else is going to pay more for it in the future. Yeah, it's a little confusing. I mean, if someone makes a piece of digital art, so you can have these programs where you draw a picture, a beautiful picture that looks maybe like a painting, but it's replicable in exactly the same fashion over and over and over ad infinitum. That's not the same as owning a physical painting, which can never be copied perfectly, but can be copied well only at substantial cost. So I'm kind of talking in circles here because I too am confused about why NFTs have much value at all.
Yes.
Especially because it's a little bit different in that Bitcoin is a pretty, what we say, liquid market, in that there are lots of people buying and selling them. NFTs are really specific, right? I mean, if you've got this image of a monkey that's an NFT, you got to find someone who really wants that. It's not the same thing as a Bitcoin, which you can always, at least for now, just go and find someone to give you dollars in exchange from it. You have to find someone who wants that image. I don't know that there's going to be a ton of people who want to pay a lot for the NFT of this Zoom room.
Or Neil, the example that comes to my mind is Melania Trump selling an image of the hat she wore for some meeting with a foreign head of state.
Yes, and actually bought it herself.
Yeah.
Because she wasn't able to sell it for what she wanted to sell it for.
Exactly, but you can make it seem like it's worth something if someone is buying it, and that's also a sense in which, maybe it's bad that this area isn't regulated. I mean, you couldn't do that in any sort of normal offering of stock or of some other type of asset where you, under some other identity, actually are the one who's paying for it to prop up its price. No, you can't do that. That's fraudulent, right? So there are aspects of this that are at the very least fraud adjacent, and I think maybe sometimes the silliness of it all obscures that, but it's not yet illegal. It's just kind of maybe weird, impractical. Because it feels like a game, I feel like maybe people don't bring their normal sense of morality to this world sometimes.
Colbert made an NFT of the lunch bag that he wrote out the description of what an NFT was that he used on his show. And the ridiculousness was that, like, that image, he used that image on his show.
Yeah.
So nationally, everyone had it, and then they created an NFT of it and they sold it for like some ridiculous amount of money, and which they donated to charity. So
yeah,
which is nice, but who bought that NFT?
Yeah, I think there's a story in the New York Times. They did it too, where they were saying, "Oh, I bet we could get $500 for this," and they end up selling it for $50,000.
Yeah, it's craziness, because that image is readily available on the Late Show's website. Like, so it's not exclusive.
Yeah, and anyone can go and watch the video on YouTube and take a picture of it, and they've got it too.
Yeah, but somebody paid like $75,000 for that NFT.
Yeah,
A brown paper bag of Stephen Colbert's handwriting explaining what an NFT is.
Yeah, so I mean, my prediction, could be wrong, is this technology is probably something, but this ain't it. I don't think this is what this blockchain technology will ultimately be used for.
Yeah, I think, didn't Jordan's first jump shot sell for like $1 million?
Yeah, something like that. It's crazy. I mean, it does make you think. I mean, I remember the first time I heard of Bitcoin from my uncle, you know, like the year after it was founded, and it's like, oh, maybe I should have listened to him. You know, if I'd put in $400, I could be a billionaire. But I don't think it would have come from producing any socially beneficial service or good. I don't think that there's any real economic value here. I think it's just taking money from other people, whether that's people currently or people in the future. You know, if I bought Bitcoin if I put $400 worth of Bitcoin in 2010 and sold it for 400 million last year, I got to think I got a lot of money from people who maybe were just dumb. I mean, that's like where if I think about this, where it would probably go in the future. I think, could be wrong, the value is probably going to go down eventually, and that means that somebody's going to be stuck with tons and tons of losses. And that's kind of, you know, because it's all anonymous, that's an easy thing to do. But I think, you know, you want to think, is that really how you want to make a bunch of money? I don't know.
Yeah, and that guy that bought that NFT, that Jordan NFT for $1 million is not making that money back.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah,
Yeah, everybody owned that poster. I didn't like basketball, and I owned that poster.
Mhm.
It's like the tulip wars.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think you could get your 400 million today? If you said, I'm going to sell it today, my 400 Bitcoins, you can, in your bank account tomorrow, have $400 million?
It would probably take a while, because I don't think you'd be able to get $400 million from any one transaction. But you could, you know, if you've got, you know, let's say that you have 100 Bitcoins, that's $4 million. So let's say, I guess it'd be whatever the math is. Yeah. You start selling them to people for 40,000 a piece, or, you know, or in even smaller increments. You know, you can recoup a lot of that. You're not going to get $400 million from one person, but you could get 40,000 here, 50,000 there, 2,000 there over time. Now, to be clear, I don't have that. I don't have 40 Bitcoins. I'm just saying, if I had spent $400, you know, based on what my uncle was telling me about 12 years ago, I would probably say, well, I'm not spending $400 on that. But, you know, if I knew what I knew now, maybe I would.
No, I just went back to my earlier question: is how easy it would be to sell it, and in fairly, because it's time now. I want to get out of it.
If you had one Bitcoin, it'd be pretty easy to sell that for $40,000 or whatever exact number it is today. What happens in any sort of bubble or financial crash is that it's pretty easy to sell something until it becomes impossible. And again, I'm not saying that it's going to crash. I don't know. You know, I don't think that this is where this technology will end up in the long run, but I don't know that it is ever going to crash completely. I don't know that it's ever going to, and I don't know when, if I did know that. So it's hard to predict these things, and even betting on them to lose money could lose you a lot of money in the interim. So, you know, if you go back and if you've read or seen the movie The Big Short, the people that ended up making money betting against these big banks that were going in on these mortgage-backed securities, they lost a lot of money along the way and almost had to essentially close up shop because they were losing so much money along the way until they were right. So, you know, even if you were right, you may not be able to make money on something. So I can take maybe one more question, and then I'm going to have to leave.
Sanford Belden, go ahead.
You're
You're
muted.
muted.
So if we were to ask you what you think the likely application of this technology in the future will it be as a currency replacement? Will it be as an investment vehicle? You've talked about both of those possibilities and the strengths and limitations of each. What other applications do you foresee as being at least possible, if not likely?
So I'll highlight again, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. But again, this is just my opinion. I don't think it is going to be any sort of currency replacement. I think there's probably some good application of the self-executing smart contracts, where, you know, if some transaction occurs, another transaction is automatically executed. For example, royalty rights for musicians, right? So they could publish a song, sell it as, say, like an NFT, or distribute it solely on the blockchain, and every time someone buys it, automatically some small piece of that transaction goes to them, so that they're earning royalties on that. That's a possibility. I don't think that's changing the nature of the economy by itself, but it could be applied in other ways. So there's that. The last thing that I think is, this is super speculative on my part, but has to do with the nature of computer code. If I send you some application via email and you open it up, you've now got a copy of it on your computer, including if that's a virus. Now, I mean, obviously you're getting a computer virus would be bad, but once you have it, you can, or someone with, you know, I don't know how to do this, but people can look at it and figure out what the virus does, and we can write a code to block that virus. It's possible that not this iteration, but maybe some other iteration of blockchain technology like NFTs somehow makes that code inaccessible, right? That you can't have a copy of it on your computer. It somehow runs, and it is now in your computer, but not on it. You know, again, super speculative. I could see some malicious uses of this technology beyond just facilitating our normal normal types of crime. I could see something like that possibly happening in the future. Again, super speculative. I was thinking about this as just like the nature, thinking about, especially with the war in Ukraine, and how cyber warfare using computer viruses or other forms of hacking has to constantly evolve, because once it's out there, people can learn how it works and block it. Whereas, you know, a nuclear bomb is a nuclear bomb, right? You use it and it's done, but you've got another one, right? That nobody can block a nuclear bomb once it's, you know, detonated. So I don't know, I was just thinking about that and thinking about different applications. That was one that I started to think of. Again, I don't know exactly how that would work or if it even could, but something that occurred to me. So there are lots of different, it's very, because this technology does so, I would say so little right now, but solves such a fundamental problem that it might have really far-reaching consequences. And it's really hard to say what those are, what they would be if they exist, and when they would happen. Again, long-winded way of saying, I really don't know. I really don't know.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Neil. That was a terrific program. I think I certainly feel a lot more cognizant of what this whole subject is, and we look forward to getting your slideshow and all those recommended articles and books as well.
Great. I will send those. Should I just send those to you or you and Mindy?
Why don't you say, yeah, to Mindy, and then she can distribute them.
Okay.
Yep,
Great.
I will send them to everyone that registered.
Okay, great. I'll get those to you later today.
Thank you.
Yep,
Great.
along with a link to the recording.
Yes. And okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Neil.
Everyone.
And thank you, everybody, for attending.